Welcome to the next panel, the first panel, Activity Assessing Vulnerability. So just to kind of recap where we were this morning, we heard about the relevance of the projections in our built environment, and Jennifer really kind of set the stage very nicely. We've talked about the tools of the compact and how they were developed, and then we talked a little bit about planning and policy. But this actually is my favorite part of the day, when we're actually talking about what do we practically do with this type of information? How do we actually start to apply this? And we've assembled a panel of 3 engineers from 3 different disciplines, and they're going to give you their perspective. They're going to tell you how these kinds of tools are being used today and how you can use them yourself in the future and how they're going to continue using it. So with that, I have a panel of 3. We're going to start with Lenny from Broward County, and then we're going to go down to Miami-Dade with Bertha, and then end up with Carlos giving us a little bit more of a wider state perspective. I'm going to ask each panelist to do about 10 minutes, so then we actually have some time at the end for some questions and answers. So with that, Lenny, take it away. Thank you.
All right, so there's basically 2 things that I'll go over today. Some are the stumbling blocks that basically prevent us maybe from getting with designing to sea level rise, and then some pragmatic, practical examples of maybe some things we could start incorporating right now in our designs. So the stumbling blocks can be things like scale. You know, obviously this is a huge endeavor. We've all seen a lot of different ways that we can look at designing for sea level rise, looking at various, options for bringing in pumps, raising everything up. Do we just adapt and allow the water in? And then a lot of the futuristic conditions. We saw earlier the sea level rise projections and the various numbers, and which one do you pick, and how do you decide to do it? And also, the costs associated with making these big changes. And so to that end, we brought down MIT, and they were nice enough to do an urban design studio with us, and they called it Terra Sorta Firma. And the students came down and they looked at all these various ways that we might look at the big picture, of moving forward. And I think a lot of us see these, and it's like, well, when do we start doing that? And clearly, you don't necessarily decide to do this one day on the design that you're doing. And this, the first theme is elevating and hardening the shoreline. And here they came up with, ways that we could harden the shoreline and elevate the structures behind it. And this is just another example of what, the beaches might look like. And clearly, we're a long way from this. Another theme that they had is this concept of clustering development along transit corridors. And, to the left is north, and you've got the Turnpike, and you've got I-95, and you basically move the development. Not really moving or anything. I wonder if this died. Might have to view down. Not much, not so much. Yeah, just quit working. Yeah, I won't do anything, Sam. Maybe the mouse over there? Should I go to the front and just I'll just do it down there.
No problem. We're adapting already. No worries.
So yes, clustering development along transit-oriented corridors. So we've got the Turnpike, and you could basically raise everything up along those areas, maintain your transit thoroughfares, here maintain connections to the port, the airport. Oh, nothing. Interesting. Is it back? Okay, there we go. All right, so again, here's the Florida Turnpike, and the students drew all this, and here's I-95, raising things up, maintaining the connectivity to the port and the airport, and they came up with ideas for how the shipping lanes could be preserved and, how we could store and all that good stuff. Then another idea is inland islands, and this is sort of that, living with the water, here's somebody's commuting by boat, everything's, raised up. My personal favorite, water is open space. Here you've got this interconnected series of water bodies, and you've got water in various places. It was really interesting how they did this. They basically looked at a pathfinding algorithm. They took all the topography, they took the existing drainage system, they took some low-lying areas, and they used pathfinding algorithms to connect them, and you end up with this really organic, interconnected set of water bodies. And this is kind of conceptually what it could look like. And all of these are based on, real roads and real areas in Broward. It was real topo data. This is not something that they just kind of imagined. They actually took all the data that we had and came up with ways that we could adapt in the longer term. But of course, that leaves us with, what do we do until then? What do we do until all this happens? And one of the things they came up with that was really interesting and stuck with me is this idea of the flux zone. It basically said everything between now and this future is in flux. And how do we adapt and manage that during that time frame? And so, right now, what do we do when we design a project? We look at water quality, we look at water quantity. What we don't do, though, is look at what the changing conditions are over the lifespan of the project that we design. We don't say, hey, pragmatically I can look at this and I know I'm going to have, 24 inches of sea level rise. Or maybe more precisely, we've got modeling that's on its way where you could look and see real time what's going to happen in those areas. So one of the things that we could do is when we do our designs, look at two sets of calcs, one for today and one for the future scenario. Maybe we can't look at the end of life of the project or a very resilient design. That would obviously be ideal. Maybe we just look at a pragmatic sort of time frame that we think is reasonable that we can accommodate in our design. We can do this using tools that we already have available today. I really hope that there's some neat new technologies that come out. But until that happens, we do have tools right now that we use, and I'm going to go over two of them today, that are adaptable to sea level rise. One of them is exfiltration trench. We use this all the time, every day. As the water table rises, the trench becomes more saturated, and it becomes less effective. But there's a formula for that. It's called the conservative formula. We know we can predict how the trench will operate when sea level rise occurs. Another tool that we use that's sort of immune or adaptable to sea level rise is called a drainage well. Now, we've got about 680 of these in Broward. They're predominantly east of US 1 right now. But as sea level rise occurs, we envision that moving farther and farther west, maybe as far west as I-95. Typically, today, drainage wells are anywhere from nothing, 80 gallons per minute or something, up to about 1,000 gallons per minute per foot ahead. We typically use a conservative estimate of about 250 gallons per minute per foot ahead for these wells. So I'm going to give you some practical examples. These are real projects based on real numbers, real data, real calculations. They weren't designed for sea level rise, but I can show you how they could have been adapted to it. In this particular instance, this building is elevated above surface level parking. You can see the design elevation there and a picture of what it looks like today. On the left-hand side, you've got the calculations that were permitted. And basically, we used a wet season water table of 1.5 feet. This is in the area where there's pretty much a 1-to-1 ratio between sea level rise and the projection. So in the sea level rise scenario, it might be 3.5. You could use that number. Well, the boxes are green on the left because clearly it met water quality and quantity. And then on the right, when we raise the water table, well, the trench no longer provides water quality, and the drainage well, while it's trying its best, is no longer protecting the site to the 100-year. Well, what happened to it? Well, it lost about 1/3 of its capacity because we had less pressure head, we had less unsaturated depth, we lost all the void space in the rocks, the trench did not perform as well. And then the drainage well, it continued to discharge, but instead of about 4.5 CFS, it only could give us about 1.5 CFS at peak. So how do we fix that? Well, one of the things that we could do is if you look at this site, it was really close. All we had to do is add 40 feet of trench, which back when I used to do drainage design calcs, it was about $10,000 for 100 feet of trench. So we're talking less than $10,000. If the trench had been put in when it was designed, it would continue to provide water quality throughout the design life of the project. Now, that could also be retrofitted. And the drainage well itself, we can make it continue to provide protection if we were to add a pump, which is something that we do today on certain drainage projects if they're very close to the coast. So this shows you the site plan of the site, and it shows you how, even though they didn't intentionally do this, there is room on the site to go back and retrofit it with that additional 40 feet of trench, and there is room to go back and make the well box bigger and put a pump in. So that could have been done either when it was originally designed, or you could set it up so that it could be done in the future. This is a comparison of what a gravity drainage well looks like and a retrofit, or how you would do a pumped well. Now, the second example, again, real world example on the eastern part of the county. Here the site is up on some stem walls. The habitable floor is up high. Again, calculations, it's 1/2 foot NAVD for the water table today, 2.5 in the sea level rise scenario. In this case, they used dry detention. That dry detention becomes inundated and does not work during sea level rise. And here, the only real issue was the 25-year 3-day berm. Again, the berm gets overtopped in the sea level rise scenario. So how do you fix this site? Well, you could retrofit it with exfiltration trench. Again, 85 feet of trench, probably less than $10,000 if you had put it in initially. And then, of course, you'd have to raise the perimeter berm. Again, going back to the site plan and look at it, there is an area where the 2 dry retention ponds are. You could put the exfiltration trench there later or now. And then, of course, you'd have to raise the orifice on the discharge and the perimeter berm, but they could all be done at some point in the future. And then finally, we look at a more inland site. This one is just west of I-95. And here they haven't raised the building up over parking, but they have raised the building on stem walls. Now this has the benefit of allowing you to take advantage of surface storage today without raising the entire site and allowing the building to be raised against a future sea level rise condition for the 100-year. So in this particular case, they overestimated on exfiltration trench. So they've got about 3 times as much trench as they need. They've got surface storage protecting to the 100-year. And then the big consideration on this was the parking lot. They had to get the 5-year 1-hour storm protected so the cars wouldn't flood. They kept the parking lot low. They were able to manage that. However, sea level rise comes along, and now the parking lot's got 2 feet of water on it. And the trench still works, but just barely. And the building's fine because it was raised above the potential sea level rise scenario. However, about 2.5 feet of water were flowing off the site onto our neighbors, which is not very neighborly. So how do we fix it? Well, basically what we could do is add a drainage well. And these can be retrofitted onto sites. We can also then raise the parking lot. Now what this does is we look at the site. We've got places to raise the site. The building was already higher, so we can mesh that higher elevation. If you look on the right there, you can see where it was low. If we raise it up high, it's still below the base flood. The drainage well could be brought in because it would be, saltwater intrusion would allow its use. And even assuming 250 gallons per foot a head in the calculations, this site would be protective during the 100-year storm. And then finally, this is a very practical matter when you're looking at a utility site. Let's say that you go onto your utility and you're going to be putting in some new pumps or some new electrical boxes or retrofitting the air conditioner or something like that. You can look at what the sea level rise projections show the 100-year to be on that site, maybe raise the air conditioner, raise the utilities that serve it, and then project those further inside the building. And you can see where it doesn't take much to raise these electrical boxes, pumps, other things inside the building so that they are protective. So if you're replacing them anyway, you could look at maybe raising them up and considering a future condition. And then these buildings typically aren't finished construction, so if they were, water were to get in and everything was elevated, it would not be a, significant impact. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Lenny. I really appreciate sort of the peek into the decision-making process and how things can be fixed if you're thinking ahead. So as we transition to Bertha, who's going to talk to us about water and sewer in Miami-Dade County utilities.
Good morning. I'm going to be talking about assessments that we did for our system and like one practical example when we are trying to apply a criteria. Just a quick overview of the water and sewer department. We are the largest utility in the Southeast the United States. We serve about 2.3 million residents at a very large budget, operate 3 water treatment plants, 3 wastewater treatment plants. So we're a very large utility, and our facilities are all located in the coast, or at least the wastewater plants, which are the most critical facilities that will be impacted by climate change. Back in 2008, the Ocean Outflow legislation passed. 2 of our facilities are impacted by that, the North District and the Central District wastewater treatment plants. For those, we need to implement advanced wastewater treatment or equivalent. We need to implement reuse and be out of the outfall by 2025. The preliminary cost of implementing that program is $3.6 billion just to comply with the legislation. But we didn't do it in isolation. We looked at projections for the year 2035. So when you add those facilities that we need for growth, the total program is $5.3 billion. So that's big enough that we need to take it very serious and look at the impacts of climate change before we start building all these things. To assist us with implementing the program, we hired CH2M Hill, who is our owner representative for the program. They did a significant, extensive assessment of how climate change will impact to us. I'm not going to get into the details because in the next panel, Lauren Van der Tak, oh, he's here. He's going to be getting into more of the details. But basically, I just want to mention that we look at rainfall projections and sea level rise projections, and we use the compact, the October 2015 projections. When we got started, we were working with the 2011, but they finally got released, so we quickly incorporated those in all our modeling. So we look at wastewater flows for the future. We took in consideration rainfall and climate change so that our flows will be higher, wastewater flows will be higher in the future. Did storm surge modeling, inundation mapping, look at wind and also sea level rise pressure changes, and then did a risk-based cost benefit analysis of how would it take to harden our facilities. We look at a number of scenarios, and then Lauren's gonna go over this, but basically we look at 2040, 2075, we look at different climate scenarios, but mostly the 8.5, like the worst case. Various design storms, we currently design for peak flows for a 2-year storm, so we look into that in a lot of details, and and Lauren will show you that the future 2-year storm is going to be much higher than what it is today. So we're taking that into consideration. And then we look at the NOAA and the Army Corps of Engineers projection. But most for our critical facilities, we are looking at the NOAA projections, which is the highest of all the projections. This is a summary of the criteria that was recommended for our wastewater plants. Basically, new facilities that we're going to build to comply with the fall legislation will be elevated critical infrastructure from anywhere from 17 to 20, depending on which treatment plant. At the wastewater treatment plants, we think this is going to be a lot easier to do because we can have a building inside the plant. We can put all the electrical on the second floor, so it will cost some, but it's really not that critical to do. But what we are now addressing is how do we do this for pump stations that are all throughout the county. And we have over 1,000 pump stations in our collection system. The work that CH did, they evaluated some critical pump stations that are going to be upgraded as part of the ocean fall legislation and also consent decree. So those are about 142 stations. They came up with a criteria that for all those 142, the existing elevation of those stations are anywhere between 5 feet and 16. And 16 is a regional pump station, so that one it's not going to require a lot of upgrades. Then we look at 2 scenarios, 2040 and 2075. For 2040, the stations would require to be elevated anywhere from 7 to 17 feet. For a 2075 scenario, anywhere from 9 to 19. I have on the side this graph showing like useful life of facilities. So not everything is going to fall in the 2040 or the 2075. Those are just 2 scenarios. But basically, for every pump station or every facility that we upgrade, we're going to look at your useful life. And we're going to look at the projections for that useful life rather than go to the end of the century. So this is a picture of one pump station, which is one of the first ones that we're looking at. And it's an old picture. This is not the way it looks today, but it's the only one I had that shows that the water is right in the back. So if you look at, right behind the pump station is like a waterway, and that is right next to the Intercoastal Waterway. This station is at 8.5 feet right now. If we do the 2040 criteria, we will have to elevate it to 15, like elevate the panel to 15 feet. And if we do the 2075, longer life, it will have to be like 18. Well, this pump station happened to be in a very high-scale neighborhood. In this graph, you can see what it says point of connection. That's where the pump station is at. The house right behind it is assessed at $5 million. The one across the street is 5.5. So we realized very quickly that there's no way we're going to put a panel 19 feet of elevation and 19 feet in front of all these houses. So this is what we're struggling with right now, how to do that, how to protect it, and at the same time be able to blend with the neighborhood and provide the protection that is needed. This is how that station looks today. We have planted some landscaping in front. You can see the house in the back. You can see the roof. So it's right next to it. It's within the property. So this is a pump station we did recently. And we will look at this to see, well, can we fit this there? This one is one that is not right on the coast, not too far from the coast. And it was not really done to protect for sea level rise. This one was, the elevation was 7 feet. So all we did is we brought it to today's standards. So basically, base flood elevation plus 1. So this is to a total of 11 feet. We had those holes at the bottom so water can flow through. We tried to look at how will this design look in that neighborhood. And this is how it looks like if we move it over there. Definitely it's not going to be something we can do in that neighborhood. And we're going to have to work with the neighbors and come up with something creative. So one of the things CH2M Hill is going to do for us, they're getting another task to look at more detail of design criteria for pump stations and come up with a different set of tools or different options that we could implement, because the bottom line is that criteria is not one size fits all. We're going to have to be, every pump station will have to be looked at for where it's at, what is the impact, and what does it serve? Is it a pump station that serves a hospital or school or critical facilities? Those will have to be protected more than something that is just maybe just a residential neighborhood that they may not have power when a storm event happens, so we will be easier to recover in that area. So that's kind of the things that we're looking at. So that's it.
Thank you, Bertha. At the City of Miami Beach, we're actually having very similar issues as we're adapting and raising roads and putting in these pump stations. They don't always quite fit with the neighborhoods. And so I think it's really important as we start to, this process and continue to adapt, we not only work with the engineers and public works, but bring in the urban planners, bring in the planning and zoning department, and really work to harmonize the neighborhood as we continue to adapt. So. We're going to end up now here with Carlos, who's going to give us a kind of a wider perspective. And Carlos, I'll warn you, there are a few Miami Beach engineers in the room. I know I saw a sneak peek of your presentation. So,
yeah. Good morning, everybody. My name is Carlos Ribbeck with Ribbeck Engineering, and I'm a consultant with the Florida Department of Transportation, District 6. And with me, I have other consultants too, engaged in major projects that mainly deals with drainage infrastructure upgrade to address current sea level rise effects. We're working with FDOT District 6, recently constructed 2 miles of reconstruction along Alton Road in Miami Beach. We were able to raise the road, and 3 pump stations were constructed as part of this project. We're also engaged in 2 additional segments along Alton Road that are under design, Alton Road from Michigan to 43rd Street, and the segment farther to the north from 43rd Street, where the Mount Sinai Hospital is, all the way up to Allison Road. We're talking about close to $80 million of work between these 2 segments in terms of road reconstruction and pump station infrastructure upgrade. We're talking about king tide season, and I wanted to share this video that was flown from my drone. back in September 29th of 2015 at the peak of Quinta in Miami Beach. I don't know, we can go ahead and play the video so I can give you a little bit of a tour. Do you have the video? Yeah? Okay, here it goes. This video was filmed on September 29th, 2015, around 10:30 in the morning. It shows the effects of king tide season along Indian Creek. The creek raised to elevation 2.2 NAVD, and at this elevation, the creek overtopped the seawall in the back of the roadway curb and create major flooding, especially between the segments of 27th Street and 35th Street, resulting in traffic closure for about 4 hours. The city of Miami Beach put a mega effort in order to mitigate or fight with this flooding. They mobilized 12 pump station mobile units. They put in place floatable barriers, inflatable barriers, sand cement bags in order to prevent the higher waters levels on the creek to overtop and create the flooding, but the flooding went in anyway. So right now we're working on a high priority project that will involve reconstructing Indian Creek, raising the profile at least 1.5 to 2 feet, plus providing a 72-inch trunk line along almost a mile stretch of this roadway facility, plus a 50,000 gallons per minute pump station located right across 32nd Street. As you can see in the video, that's where the major flooding started at 28th Street. The roadway elevation, varies from, the gutter elevation varies from elevation 1 to 2, but the seawall in many places lies below elevation 1. So at 2.2, you had over a foot of water overtopping the roadway facility. The back of curb also had at least 6 blocks of elevation below 2.2. What you see is basically half a foot of water overtopping through the back of curb into Indian Creek Drive from 28th Street all the way up to 35th Street. You can see the tanks in green are the pump station, the mobile units. The city had to mobilize 10 or 12 of those pumps in order to pump out the water that was getting in. We also had flooding from the effect of groundwater seepage, especially through a lot of the drainage wells. There's a lot of drainage wells that provide drainage within private property as well as within the public roadway facility. So all the water was coming up from these drainage wells, creating all this flooding. So FDOT is working together with the city of Miami Beach to put in place, number one, reconstructing the seawall, raise the seawall from the substandard elevation 0.5, 1 foot NAVD to 5.7 NAVD, reconstruct the roadway which lies mainly at elevation 1 to 1.5 all the way to 2.7, build the pump station, 50,000 gallons per minute pump station, and provide drainage to this facility, a mile stretch facility from 25th Street to 41st Street, which also will provide drainage to the parallel roadway, which is Collins Avenue, another state road facility. We're talking about over 40 acres of drainage contribution. And that's an example of the type of efforts FDOT and the city of Miami Beach is putting together to address sea level rise impacts. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. That's really a great example of how cooperation is needed. This is actually a state road. It's A1A, but it's right in the middle of Miami Beach. And the beach, as you know, has an aggressive stormwater management program. with the pumps, the seawalls, and elevating the roads. So Miami Beach really fought hard, went to Tallahassee a few times, and lobbied quite a bit to accelerate this program. And right now they're in the negotiation phase. And Jay, if I'm not mistaken, we'll probably start construction this summer, right? Or yeah.
Within a month, we're going to start construction on seawalls and other things. Right now, we're doing survey work and engineering.
Okay. So right now we have some time for some questions and answers. Hopefully you've been saving those. If you wouldn't mind coming up to the microphone, then we have experts here that have actually been working with these tools and really making it part of that decision-making process. So are there any questions for the panel? Dr. Gassman.
My question is for,
I don't know.
My question is for Bertha. When you're planning for a long-term sea level rise impact and you're looking at all of your pump stations, how do you consider how your customer base is going to change and whether that pump station is actually going to have an area to serve given the elevation of the surrounding properties?
We have not considered that yet. We are aware that it's a possible scenario. We're only including the planning so far, as I said, future projections, which are higher flows. But if we don't do anything like this neighborhood where I show the pump station 21, which is very low, and by the intracoastal, if those people start getting flooded and they move away, or then we will have less flow to handle. So, but we at this point are not considering that yet. We really don't know what the future is going to be as far as people moving or leaving the area. So all we're doing is population projections and the impacts to flows from climate.
If you have questions, if you just come to the mic, please.
Yeah. Hello, Barry Heimlich again. In 2009, I was the lead researcher on a research project at FAU that was sponsored by the National Commission on Energy Policy, which is part of the bipartisan conference in Washington. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan political action research or a think tank. And the question that we were addressing was what effect is sea level rise going to have on the water systems in a macro way? This was very early in the thinking. People weren't thinking about this subject very much in 2009. One of the interesting findings that we had from this study, which we reported in late 2009, was that as little as 6 inches of sea level rise would reduce the drainage capacity of our major storm drainage canal systems by as much as 70%. And in fact, that all of the capacity would be lost by the time sea level rose 2 feet. And that's because the water table is here, sea level is here. It really, throughout most of South Florida, it's 2 feet or less, this differential. And by the time sea level rise comes up by 2 feet, there's no way for gravity to drain the rainfall. We have 60 inches of rain a year. Each inch of rain is equivalent to 17 million gallons per square mile. That means in a year's time, 1 billion gallons of rain falls on every square mile. If we have a 3-inch rainfall during a heavy thunderstorm on a July afternoon, that's 50 million gallons per square mile. It needs to go somewhere. Now, by the way, this...
Excuse me, Barry, do you have a question for the panel?
Yes, I'm coming. What are we... Well, the question is, are we addressing this issue? It is recognized. South Florida Water Management District knows it's the case, and so does the Army Corps of Engineers. And there's some talk about retrofitting some of the pumping stations, but I don't think enough is being done soon enough.
So the question is, are we addressing the issue? Do you?
Yes.
Well, he's comment and questions mostly about stormwater management, which is not something our department handles, so. I don't know if you guys have something to add.
Yeah, I would say we're addressing the issue, but we're partially addressing the issue. I think all what we can do for now is keeping up with raising the roadways, retrofits the gravity storm sewer systems to pump stations. But as sea level rise, we're buying time. As sea level rise keeps rising, eventually we'll have to go into a different level of infrastructure upgrade. We'll have to work municipalities, county, state, with the federal government in a much larger scale in terms of infrastructure upgrade that address these issues, like, for instance, all these tidal gates that's been constructed in Netherlands, in Venice. We're talking about billions of dollars in terms, which will provide us a more comprehensive protection in terms of flooding and sea level rise. I don't know if you want to add something else, Len.
Sure. So basically, in the presentation I gave, I showed you that we currently use the average wet season water table that was on the left, which for one of the projects was like 0.5. And then the sea level rise water table was like 2.5. And where that permitted design came from is from the Broward County average wet season water table map, which is the design standard that people would use in order to compute how good the exfiltration trench is functioning or how high the 100-year 3-day storm event that occurs on the site is. And so one of the things the county is doing is looking at updating those wet season water table maps. Now, whether or not they end up getting adopted and becoming the de facto design standard, those will be available, A, for people to use, or B, if they did become the design standard, then instead of having to retrofit the site, when you calculated it in the first place, it would come up with the worst case scenario for the trench based on the sea level rise projection. And then the other map that we have is called the Broward County 100-year flood map. And that map is a futuristic extrapolation of what the 100-year elevations for buildings would be at some future scenario. When it was done back in the 70s, it assumed build-out conditions in the county, which were there right now, and originally required elevations of buildings up to 2 feet or 4 feet above the FEMA numbers. And so we're, again, looking at including sea level rise projections in the Broward County 100-year flood map, and were it to be adopted, it would create design standards and building elevations that are predictive of sea level rise scenarios. So.
Any other final questions?
I'm Dolly McIntyre from Miami. My question is, has anybody addressed the issue of Turkey Point? A lot of these other things are going to be moot if we're all dead because of radiation. And I haven't heard anything about anybody thinking about sea level rise as it relates to Turkey Point. Have you?
Well, the panel is not from FPL, so we're not going to put them on the spot. And, I think that's probably a better question directed at folks who may not be in the room. I don't know if there's anybody from FPL in the room. But, just to stay on time, I'm going to ask each panelist to give some parting thoughts. What are your takeaways or key messages for the audiences as they get back to their offices? So, Bertha?
As I said, at the end of my presentation, I think one size doesn't fit all. I think what we all need to do is develop tools that we have in the toolbox, and as we design facilities that we take from the toolbox, but every situation is going to be different. And like Nancy asked, it's been all in our minds that the population may change, but we do not have that data today. So we have to design assuming that the population projections that we have today are going to happen in the future. Our plan for addressing the ocean outfall, we're looking at 2035 as far as projections. So since that's all we have, that's all we're designing for right now. But that's in the back of our mind that may be a possible scenario.
On my side, I just want to emphasize that the Florida Department of Transportation especially in the past 5 years, have been engaged, and every year is more intense in terms of upgrading all these trench infrastructure that no longer can address increased sea levels. So as we move ahead in the upcoming years, we see more of these projects of raising roadway profiles, upsizing storm sewers, and combining with pump stations. Eventually, as years go ahead, we'll require to work together, not only at the local, county, and state level, but also with the federals, because it will involve major infrastructure, and therefore it will involve major cost in terms of infrastructure repairs.
I guess for me, it would just be the concept that for the designers out there, when you're looking at your projects, you know, that they're in flux, they're in the flux zone, as those MIT students put it. And you can look at, you know, some lifespan of your project and try to see what changes are going to occur over that time frame and make, you know, very practical, pragmatic decisions about things that you can do for relatively low cost that would help them be resilient over the lifespan of the project.
Let's give our panelists a round of applause and thank you.